Welcome back, Dave Jagrosse. We are doing a Beyond Clean vendor spotlight. You've been here before, and you're getting famous, my friend, because you recently were on a Becker's webinar. Look at you just climbing to
Correct.
the top.
I get around.
Well, so that makes me think that everybody who is listening to this episode or watching the video is familiar with you. But just in case somebody out there hasn't crossed your path, maybe you could give everybody a background. And I do want to say you've been on educational episodes, you've been on other vendor spotlights. If
Sure.
anybody has downloaded the Beyond Clean smartphone app, all they got to do is look up Dave or David Jagrosse. We're going to call you Dave, but I bet in some of the write-ups we've got some Davids in there. But you can just search that, and all of your episodes will pop right up in the filter. So
Yeah, that's great. And
you'll be
thank you.
inducted into the Beyond Clean Hall of Fame at some
Thank you.
point.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity again. Yes, I have an extensive background in sterile processing, over 35 years. Started as a technician, was a supervisor, a manager, worked my way through working with my local chapter, my HSPA chapter, got involved with HSPA. I was past president. I did 6 years with the HSPA and got involved with the AMI committees. I wanted to be involved with the groups that write the standards that we follow. I suggest others do the same. And that led me to an independent career. A few years ago, I was able to work up my consulting business enough to leave the hospital and do this full time. So appreciate being here again.
Well, I'll echo what you said about getting involved with Amy and getting on the committees, and more provider involvement is really critical to the success of that organization, Dave. So kudos to you for
Justin,
jumping
I'm
on that
I'm proud
early.
to announce that the last AMI meeting for ST79 users comprised 51% of the meeting for the first time. So we're getting there.
That is amazing. That's
Yes.
great news. Awesome,
Yes.
Dave. I bet it was a lot due to your recruiting efforts out there as
Yes,
well.
yes, and Jameed and a few others. Yeah, the other users.
Great. Well, let's talk about this Becker's presentation. I mean, that's what's kind of led us to this conversation today. Um, they were really talking to you about the importance of asking your manufacturer if their sets are validated and understanding the risks associated with non-compliance. And so, I think maybe setting the baseline here, this is a kind of a complicated topic. How much awareness do you think there is out there in the industry? And I know not everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. We'll take a deeper dive here in a second, but how much awareness do you think there is around this? And it sounds like your Becker's presentation was extremely successful in increasing awareness.
Yeah, I would certainly encourage everybody to get out there and watch it. It is out there on like replay mode. But it's something that we all have our hands on, but we have to take a moment and think about specifically what we're dealing with. And in a lot of instances, and in the Becker's presentation, we were really trying to focus on instrument sets that are configured by the manufacturer and cleared by the FDA as such. And, we throw a lot of terms, Justin, as you know, we call them loaner trays, or sometimes those trays are, the hospital may buy them, they may live on our shelves, they may consign them to us, or they may come in and out of the hospital for each surgery. That's really what we were focusing on, and dealing with the potential reconfiguration of those trays once they do arrive into our sterile processing departments.
So, I mean, let's go a little bit deeper on that, right? So the awareness is sort of there, but like you said, a lot of terms get thrown around. Let's dial directly in on something that you said, which is, the FDA clears a lot of that typically non-hospital owned inventory, right?
Correct.
In many cases, it's vendor managed, so to speak, but yet we're reprocessing them in sterile processing. So, what is the risk of not using an FDA cleared organizational tray when you are trying to consolidate sets? Because obviously, you can get 7, 8 trays coming in for a particular procedure, and yet they're not going to use all of those instruments. So there's a big move in the industry
Correct.
to sort of consolidate those sets down so that there isn't so much extra work and inefficiency in the reprocessing process. And so, specifically around this, what are the risks, and maybe even help us understand the difference even further between maybe regular sort of organizational, like general instrument trays and organizers, versus
Sure.
when we're getting into this area around that loaner or consignment tray.
Yeah, that's great. It's good to clarify that. Like you said, just like we said in the beginning, not everybody may know who I am because there is a lot of newbies in the field. So if you're newer to this field or you have been in it, you have to think about what we do. We put trays together in sterile processing. We'll use mesh baskets, and we put our Kelly clamps and our regular instruments together, and we follow those instrument IFUs, and Amy gives us guidance on how to do that in the department. And you'll see some of that in the Becker's webinar that we did, showing what we do in-house, so to speak. But when we start getting into these pre-configured trays, we'll clear up some terminology here. When we talk about things being validated, um, that means that any medical device company that sells things in the U.S. has to get this clearance, has to be cleared through the FDA. And to achieve that, they're typically either using their own internal labs or they're using offsite validation labs to compile all that data. And then they submit it to the FDA and it's cleared. So the other term I want to clarify is verification. So if you could follow those steps, a manufacturer does testing validation, then they clear it through the FDA. And typically, when it comes to our departments, we do verification testing. We kind of confirm everything that was going on. That can be a little confusing for some users. But when you get into these devices that are cleared by the FDA, that means that let's think about a 3-level loaner tray, that's coming in, an orthopedic or spine tray that's coming in. When they did that validation testing, they inoculated those instruments. They tested all these instruments the way that they were configured in the trays. And that's the basis of the IFUs that we're getting. So in many instances, Justin, we talked about trying to reduce instruments, but I've seen many instances where people are adding instruments, the local reps coming in and throwing a couple of extra instruments in the pan. So when you do these things, we are deviating. There could be an increased risk of contamination with that. Um, think about the cleaning process. If there's extra instruments in there, and it wasn't designed to be clean that way, right? Or sterilization. A 3-level tray, like we discussed, is complex. These instruments are very complex. It's multi-layered. They might be made out of poly materials that don't heat well. Think of cooking like a turkey. That's why we put the thermometer into the center of the turkey to get a core temperature, right? The
Is that our
steam.
process challenge device?
Yes,
Is the
yes.
turkey
It's
thermometer?
coming
Okay.
soon to a vendor near you. But that's a good analogy, that the steam, and we have to remove the air out of the center and all these devices, and then we have to make sure that the steam gets through all 3 levels the way that that set was configured. And if we start deviating from that, we're going to create more challenges potentially. So that's really one of the core things that we
That's
have
really
to look
interesting,
at.
Dave, because I'm just thinking through that a little bit. A lot of times, there's confusion like which IFU do you follow, but general
Correct.
instrumentation, unless it's been grandfathered in, right? Like
Great point.
scissors, basic instruments. But outside of that, they're validated for sterilization sort of in any kind of general configuration. What you're
Yes.
saying is that the way that these loaner, many of them, probably not all, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but many of them, the way that they're validated is in a specific configuration, not instrument by instrument.
Correct. If you actually look at an IFU for one of these loaner trays, for the instruments, it will say, it'll be a blanket, just like we do with our major instrument companies. If I can name names like an Asculap or a V Mueller. There isn't an IFU for a Kelly clamp and a sponge stick and a so on and so on. It gives us a blanket IFU, or else we'd have 10 million more IFUs out there, right? So it's the same with these instruments, and then they're being configured into a certain arrangement and then being tested that way. So we have to consider that the IFU that we're given for that tray is based on that configuration. Um,
So
so it's
what's the
really,
risk if you
really important.
deviate? Like, let's say you're, I mean, because the consolidation efforts and trying to reduce the number of instruments has a financial impact on the workload of the department, the ability to, pull through the work instead of
Sure,
getting into a bottleneck and
sure,
again reprocessing instruments that weren't used that don't need to be reprocessed. I think this is a pretty highlighted an important initiative for health systems across the country. So if they're going to deviate in an effort to be more efficient, what are the risks that they may be, taking
sure.
on when
Yeah.
yeah. Walk me
Absolutely.
through
I
that.
mean, luckily or unluckily for some, I do a lot of legal cases. So I think first and foremost, you always, you're deviating from something and the facility's taking on risk. So we always want to consider that. I always say that there's standards, guidelines, best practices, and then in the United States, there's the legal world, right? Because we love our lawyers here in the States. So you have to look at the risk of deviating and what you could open up the facility to if something were to go wrong. And then it's not that it can't be done in a facility. It would be very time consuming and it would be costly. It may require some type of in house. See, we can do verification, but we can't really validate. The true way for a department to validate would be just like the manufacturers to send out our new configurations to a third party lab, which really isn't practical for most of us. Well, we're not going to go
Financially,
through those.
that's expensive. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's going to be
timing
costly.
timing wise, there's a challenge there, but I'd say financially it's
Yeah.
prohibitive too, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest aha moment of both the Beckers and this is that making this awareness that we can't just willy nilly move these, reconfigure these trays and add to them or take instruments away because that could impact the configurations as well.
All right, so let's just say somebody decides to go through that validation process, as a hospital, even though it's cost prohibitive, it's not really feasible operationally. Let's just say they did go through that process. What is the benefit to them? Obviously, you outlined the legal, but are there other benefits to having these trays validated?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of legal really being on the back end, like you didn't do something correctly and then you were taken to court over it, like we want to do the correct thing up front. We want to make sure that we can both clean and properly sterilize these instruments from the get-go. Like if it's one, two, three, the legal ramifications is number three on the back end, but we don't want to find out we're doing something wrong until it gets to that point.
All right. So, what do you see people out there doing? Right. So, obviously, you kind of already talked about it. You've seen vendors adding instruments into the tray, and
Correct.
but what else? Like, what else are they doing to sort of navigate this from trying to optimize it? I mean, are they just like you know creating their own instrument trays in some way, or like what are they? How are people
Correct.
dealing with
Yes,
this?
we covered a little bit of this with the Beckers. There was one instance where I was out there in the field where one vendor company did have what they called an accessory basket for extras, but it was very specific. It had it, they had cleared this with their configurations, but it was very specific. You had to have one layer of instruments on their tray that you got from them. That was probably the only instance that I ever saw a loaner company or a loaner tray type of tray have that kind of accessory basket. But other than that, like I said, I just see people, local reps or even the hospital themselves, just doing this reconfiguration without any type of true clearance or testing around it.
So, I mean, the natural and obvious move here would be to have the manufacturers start to validate their instrument sets with different types of configurations, right? Or something along those lines. But that's pretty cost prohibitive for them too. Have you seen any solutions out there that have assisted, sort of sterile processing departments from navigating this so that they can move towards efficiency and organization and less trays and less volume coming through their departments while at the same time not being exposed to the risks of kind of reconfiguring trays that were validated specifically for
Sure, sure.
configuration?
Yeah, and that kind of brings to, like, I've named a few names and we've been pretty agnostic with this, but I have seen in the field there's a company or a device out there called the EZ-TRAX. And what they've done with this device is that they've taken these configurations, they've worked with doctors for efficiency to know what they needed to reconfigure, and then they went and got those clearances that we are talking about throughout this webinar. So if there were other companies out there, there's no other companies out there that I'm aware of that do this. And, earlier we were talking about, the whys, like, yes, efficiency, but in some cases, like in an ambulatory setting, as you know, Justin, those autoclaves are half the size. They may not have washers, believe it or not, in these ASCs. So it's really, they don't have much of a choice in a lot of these ASCs. They have to try to reduce the instrumentation. It's not, yes, they'll get efficiency, but they physically can't process 10 loaner trays. They don't have the capacity for it.
Well, and that volume's getting pushed out to the ASC
And
market,
that's how
right?
it's
And
trending.
so
Correct.
to your
Yes.
point, the infrastructure might not be there to accommodate large orthopedic trays, and yet that's where we see the procedures going. So, you
Correct.
know, finding ways to do consolidation in a compliant manner is pretty critical.
Correct. And I would even challenge people to look at this when they're looking at design, because, if you're looking at doing X amount of cases a day and you're going to say, well, that means that there's going to be typically 100 loaners here. If you work with the company like EZ-TRAX, you could potentially reduce that significantly so that you won't be impacted by such high volumes.
I
You're
think
going to
about
be
storage
efficient.
too,
Correct,
right?
correct,
Like there's only so much space in these, you
correct,
know, surgery center ASC locations. Like,
correct.
and I mean, it's already in the hospital setting. We
Yes.
already knew we were working, kind of
Yeah, we don't want to
behind the
leave the
8 ball in
ORs out.
terms of
Yeah,
appropriate design and in terms of space and storage there. But in a lot of cases, the surgery centers are built into existing
correct,
buildings and they have a similar kind of struggle around storage unless it's a brand new sort of brand new build, and they started to take that into consideration. So yeah, I think about just the storage factor and wanting to reduce the number of sets that are there. I mean, and I
correct.
don't even mean long-term storage. I just mean as you're getting ready to do a number of orthopedic cases in a day and you're setting up, you
Yes.
definitely have got to be thinking about where are we gonna stage all of this before we start
And
executing on
and
the
Justin,
surgeries.
going back to that, like they say, necessity's the mother of invention, right? It was out of these ASCs where they had to have efficiencies, and that, like, the doctors that are doing the same procedures in an ASC and the same exact instruments set up in an OR, by nature of the beast, have to be efficient. They have to know, look, out of this three-level tray, I'm only going to use these four instruments. So that's where the knowledge is. That's where the efficiency is, and that's the secret sauce, is to work with those very efficient physicians to determine what instruments need to be where. And then, sometimes they open up these trays in a sequence too. That's important too, because you have to open a patient, you have to remove hardware, put new hardware in, and then close them, right? So you want things to also be sequential. But that's where that knowledge is coming from.
Dave, great job with the Becker's presentation.
Thank you.
And I definitely have enjoyed connecting with you again. And like I said, we're gonna have you up on the Hall of the Beyond Clean Hall of Fame at some point here. Anything you want to add to this conversation? I think it's important because we are under a lot of pressure to just work more efficiently, reduce waste,
Correct.
reduce cost, and finding creative ways to do that. I think set optimization is just such an obvious one.
Yeah, one of the big things I would tell people to do is to, ask these manufacturers for the parameters of these organizational trays, or at least if they're reconfigured. We got to push back. Like you said, it's very costly. It's very time consuming. But if you receive some tray that doesn't look right, I would push back and ask the vendor, because it may not be the vendor, as you know. It could be the courier. It could be the local. We have a lot of local distributors. The local distributors might be deviating and moving these trays into their own configurations. So just be a guard dog. That's what we are. We're at the front line in SPD. We're the ones that need to stop the line and make sure that our patients are safe.
All right, Dave. Well, great job as always. How you're a great resource to the industry. You've been doing quite a lot consulting, right, with David
Yes.
Jagrosse Consulting. If people wanted to reach out to you, how can they connect with you?
I think the best way would be through my email. It would be davidjagrosse@gmail.com. And I'm usually pretty quick at getting back to everyone that reaches out.
All right, so David Jagrosse, kind of all smushed in together, one email,
Yes,
one. So DAVIDJAGROSSE at gmail.com if you want to reach out to
correct.
Dave. I can, and if you reach out to me, I'll give you his home address too. Just kidding. Um,
I won't be there.
you probably won't. That's right.
No.
You'd be traveling all over the place.
Yes.
Dave, great job. And also, you talked a lot about EZ-TRAX towards the end of the conversation today. If anybody wants to learn more, they can go to www.thetotalsolution.com. Yeah, and they can find IST One Tray on LinkedIn, Facebook. They can send an email to info@onetray.com or call 937-619-0138. And as always, follow the One Tray IFU for use. And yeah, Dave, changing the game, like you said.
And thank you for the opportunity.